What would you do if an entire town laughed at you? Not behind your back, but right to your face. In the street. In the diner. In the church parking lot. Every single person in this small town had the same opinion about Walter Briggs and what he had just bought. They called it the worst decision they had ever seen. They called him foolish. They called him senile. One man even offered to buy it back from him for half the price just to save him from himself. But Walter just smiled, tipped his hat, and walked away. Because Walter knew something this entire town did not. And the day the police showed up, everything changed forever. Walter Briggs had lived in Millhaven, Tennessee his entire life. 71 years in the same town. He knew every face, every street, every story. He had worked 40 years at the local lumber mill, raised 2 sons, buried his wife Eleanor 6 years ago, and now lived alone in a small house on the edge of town with a vegetable garden and an old dog named Biscuit. Walter was not a rich man. He never had been. But he was a careful man. A patient man. A man who had spent 7 decades watching and listening while others talked. And in all those years Walter had learned one thing above everything else, that the loudest opinions are usually held by people who look the least closely. On the north end of Millhaven sat a piece of land that nobody wanted. 3 acres of overgrown field with a collapsed barn, a dry creek bed, and an old stone structure that used to be a grain storage building back in the 1800s. The property had been on the county tax delinquency list for 11 years. The owner, a man who had moved to Arizona decades ago, had simply stopped paying taxes and forgotten it existed. The county had tried to auction it twice. Both times not a single bid came in. The land was considered worthless. Contaminated with old farm chemicals, everyone said. Impossible to build on. Not worth the trouble. The asking price at the third auction, just $800. Walter had driven past that land every single day for 11 years. Every single day he had slowed down and looked at it. Not because it was beautiful. Not because it looked valuable. But because of one thing he had noticed that nobody else seemed to care about. Something small. Something easy to miss if you were driving too fast or thinking about something else. On the day of the third county auction, Walter walked in, sat down in the front row, and when the auctioneer called the lot, Walter raised his paddle. $800. Nobody else raised theirs. The auctioneer looked around the room. Silence. He looked back at Walter and said, "Sold." By the next morning the whole town knew. In Millhaven, news traveled faster than weather. At the diner on Main Street people shook their heads over their coffee. The hardware store owner said Walter had finally gone soft in the head. The town mayor, a round man named Clyde Perkins who had opinions about everything, stood outside the barber shop and told anyone who would listen that Walter had just thrown away his savings on 3 acres of poison and weeds. Even Walter's own son called from Nashville and begged him to back out. Walter listened to every single word. Then said, "Son, I've been watching that land for 11 years. I know what I saw." And hung up the phone. Here's what Walter had seen. Every single morning for 11 years when he drove past that land, the old dry creek bed had a thin line of green running along its edge. Not weeds. Not wild grass. A specific type of plant that Walter recognized from something his father had told him 60 years ago. His father, who had worked as a water surveyor in the 1950s, had told young Walter, "Son, if you ever see that plant growing in a dry bed, dig down. Because that plant only grows where there is water moving underground." Walter had never forgotten those words. And for 11 years he had watched that thin green line and waited. The week after he bought the land, Walter rented a small excavator from a yard outside of town. The man at the rental yard recognized him and smirked. Word had already spread. Walter didn't explain himself. He just signed the paperwork, drove the machine to his land, and began digging along the creek bed. 6 feet down, 8 feet, 10 feet. And then, at 11 feet below the surface, the bucket of the excavator broke through into something wet. Walter climbed down from the machine, got on his knees in the mud, put his hand into the earth, and felt cold, clean water rushing over his fingers. It was not just water. A hydrologist Walter hired from Knoxville arrived 2 days later, tested the flow, tested the depth, tested the quality. He came back to Walter with a report and a look on his face that said everything before he even opened his mouth. The underground spring was producing over 400 gallons per minute of water so clean it required virtually no treatment. The hydrologist told Walter that in his 20 years of work he had seen perhaps 3 natural springs of this quality and volume in the entire state of Tennessee. He told Walter that this water, sitting beneath land that the entire town had called worthless, was worth millions. And then the police arrived. Not to arrest Walter. Not because he had done anything wrong. They arrived because the moment news broke about the underground spring, 3 separate people filed emergency claims with the county. The previous owner in Arizona, who had abandoned the property for over a decade, suddenly remembered he owned land in Tennessee and hired a lawyer. 2 local businessmen who had laughed at Walter publicly just weeks earlier now claimed they had prior rights to the water source. The police arrived to secure the property while the county sorted out the legal questions. Walter stood at his fence and watched 2 officers tape it off. His neighbor beside him whispered, "Walter, are you going to lose it?" Walter looked at him calmly and said, "I paid my $800. I have my deed. Let them try." The legal battle took 4 months. The previous owner's claim was thrown out immediately. 11 years of unpaid taxes and 2 failed auctions meant the county sale was completely legal and binding. The 2 businessmen's claims had no basis whatsoever and were dismissed within weeks. The judge signed the final order on a Thursday morning in May. The land, the spring, and everything beneath it belonged entirely and completely to Walter Briggs of Millhaven, Tennessee. Walter's son called again from Nashville. This time he didn't say a word for almost a minute. Then he said, "Dad, how did you know?" Walter was quiet for a moment. Then said, "Because I slowed down when everyone else was speeding past." Walter was approached by 4 bottled water companies within 6 months of the court ruling. He did not sell the spring outright. Instead, he negotiated a licensing agreement that paid him a fixed amount every single month for as long as the spring produced water. He kept the land. He kept the old stone building. He restored the barn. And every morning he still walked out to that dry creek bed, now a flowing stream, and stood there quietly with his old dog Biscuit. The same town that had laughed at him now drove past slowly. Nobody laughed anymore. Here's what Walter Briggs understood that an entire town did not. Value is never on the surface. It never announces itself. It never puts up a sign. It hides beneath dead grass and dry creek beds and collapsed barns and locked safes and crumbling houses. And the only people who ever find it are the ones who slow down, who look closer, who listen to what their fathers told them 60 years ago. The town mocked Walter's cheap purchase. And then the police arrived. And the only person standing on the right side of that yellow tape was the quiet old man they had all laughed at. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to slow down today.